All right, I want to welcome my friend, comrade, and also an advocate for the new communism and the leadership of Bob Avakian and the co-spokesperson for Revolution Books in New York City to the RNL Revolution Nothing Less show. Raymond Lotta, it's good to have you back on our show.
Hey, Andy, it's really exciting to be back with you and the RNL audience.
All right, so let's get right to it. On our website, revcom.us, there's an important in-depth article by you and the Revcom Environmental Writing Group with the pithy and clever title, Worse Than Fine-Print Trickery, Biden's Imperialist Climate Bill. The devil lies in the big picture. And there's a lot packed into this title. I note that you call this an imperialist climate bill, which as we get into things we should unpack. But I want to start with your inversion of a cliche that the devil is in the details, and applied to this bill, you say, the devil lies in the big picture. What do you mean by this? What's that big picture? And why is that where the devil lies?
Precisely the point. The big picture that I'm speaking about is measured against this Climate Act. It was the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed on August 17th, which has provisions for $370 billion of credits and subsidies to act on the climate crisis, to move towards renewable energy. And what the article is getting at is, if that were in fact the case, if this were a law that was actually going to affect the rapid transition to a green economy, that would be a great thing. But in fact, it is not. This bill is part of the problem. This act, now law, is part of the problem, not the solution. So what is the big picture, Andy? Well, one, it's this enormity of the climate crisis itself, a cascading, accelerating environmental crisis that is endangering the ecosystems of the planet and the livability and the habitability of the planet. For instance, if we look at the Arctic, right now, it is the case, as a result of accelerating global warming, that the climate of the Arctic is characterized more by fluid water than by ice. That is an incredible and definitive measure of just how serious this crisis is. As we speak, there is an incredible crisis of flooding in Pakistan. One third of the country now is subjected to floods. 500,000 people have had to flee their homes in villages. Relief and aid workers can't get to them to offer the help. Farmland is submerged. You know, this is the state of the planet. 3.3 billion people, Andy, that's 40% of the Earth's population, are living in the crosshairs of serious vulnerability to climate crisis. And that means drought, rising sea levels, being forced to flee, the degradation of agriculture. This is the first aspect of the big picture, the state of the environmental crisis. The second aspect is the outsized role of the United States in this crisis. Now, what do I mean by that? It's this, that the United States is the greatest cause of the greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. Greenhouse gases are carbon and methane that trap heat in the atmosphere. And the U.S., which represents 5% of the world's population, is responsible for 25% of the carbon emissions in the atmosphere. So that's the second part of the big picture. The third part of the big picture is the rapidity and scale of measures that must be taken to cope with this crisis before, we cross a threshold in which the planet does become uninhabitable. And the fourth aspect of the big picture is the necessity to make a revolution, to actually get rid of, to overthrow this capitalist imperialist system, which is the driving cause of this climate crisis. A system, capitalism, that's characterized by private competing capitalists that treat nature as just a free input to pour into production for profit and which is despoiling this planet. So there is that aspect, the fourth aspect of the big picture, which is the need for a revolution that can actually provide the basis for us to confront and act on this crisis, and the fact that this is not just a far-off, fuzzy prospect, but we are living in a rare time when revolution becomes more possible in this country, the country that is the greatest cause of this atmospheric, environmental, existential crisis that threatens the very nature of this planet as habitable.
Raymond, those four criteria by which to measure the big picture are really important, and we're going to get into that over the next several shows. But first, I'd like to just ask you two things. One, briefly define for our audience some of the basic terms here: renewable energy, fossil fuels, global warming. And then in the article, there's this photograph of Pakistan, which you referred to, and the flood there, 1/3 of the country underwater. A big part of the big picture that you spoke about in the answer to my first question had to do with the responsibility of the U.S., but who's bearing the brunt of this?
Let's break this down for the audience. Coal, petroleum, and natural gas, they're called fossil fuels. They come from the mineralized remains of plants and animals that lived millions of years ago. They are non-renewable because once burned, they won't be replaced for millions of years or possibly ever. Solar and wind power are forms of renewable energy. You see, they come from sources that are naturally and constantly replenished and don't run out.
So the thing about fossil fuels is that when you use them, they emit, these greenhouse gases, as I said. And these are methane and carbon that trap heat in the atmosphere and contribute to the rise in global temperatures. And when we say global temperatures, we don't mean what the temperature is in Chicago or in Shanghai this week. We're talking about the planetary average. And this planetary average has risen since the advent of the capitalist, imperialist, industrial revolution, that began in the late 18th century. And as I said at the outset, the United States is the greatest historical contributor to the carbon, to these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And there is a danger point, 1.5 degrees centigrade or Celsius rise in temperatures that presents this existential danger to humanity and to the ecosystems of the planet. Here's the problem, that right now the world is on track to producing twice the amount of carbon through the use of fossil fuels that are necessary to avoid getting to that 1.5 or 2.7 degree Fahrenheit tipping point. Now that's fossil fuels. Renewable energy is solar power, is wind power, is geothermal. That's the heat, the heat like from hot springs in the earth, and also hydropower, dams that are built, right? Now here's the situation on a global scale, because we're talking about a planetary crisis. You have the advanced capitalist imperialist countries that are the greatest cause of this global warming. But the oppressed countries of the global south are, as you said, suffering the greatest consequences. Look, we started by talking about Pakistan. Pakistan has only contributed 1% to the atmospheric emissions. And yet they, as I said, are on the front lines of this crisis. Or you take Bangladesh. This is a country that has a population that's very concentrated in the coastal areas, and the sea levels are rising. And Bangladesh, the average person in Bangladesh contributes half a ton of carbon into the atmosphere each and every year. In the United States, it's 15 tons per person. that's 30 times greater per person on average. And yet, in Bangladesh, hundreds of thousands of people are facing the prospect of having to flee, of having to evacuate because of floods, more devastating cyclones, storms like hurricanes in the U.S. So this is what the state of affairs is on this planet right now. And what scientists are saying is that if we are going to move in a way that corresponds to the seriousness of the crisis, we have to slash these carbon emissions rapidly and massively, stop the use of coal and natural gas to generate electricity, and reconfigure the cars, the transport, the whole ways in which people move about and commute, agriculture. All of this has to be rapidly transformed. You look at that scientific prescription, what the scientists are telling us based on the reality of global warming, and you look at this climate act, and it is completely out of sync with what I'm describing.
So, Raymond, that was very clarifying. And I have to say, I was just astounded at the illustration of this in the article about when you spoke of mandates. I hadn't known that. Why don't you break that down for us?
Now, this new law, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the climate law, does not mandate, does not require that industry slash emissions. For instance, it doesn't say that in the next 3 years, carbon emissions have to be reduced by 50%, or that's a violation of the act, of the law. It doesn't say that. It simply provides industry, private corporate capital, with tax benefits and subsidies, financial support, to stimulate those industries to adopt renewable energy, what I described, solar and wind modes of generating power. So there is no mandate, no requirement that there be cuts in carbon emissions, but there is a mandate. And this is really an amazing, obscene, mind, crippling, phenomenon that the act requires that if the federal government is going to put up for auction land, federal lands and waters like in the Gulf of Mexico or off of Alaska, for the use of wind and solar power to build installations, that provision for land and water for solar and wind power has to be matched by the sale of land and water in the Gulf of Mexico, in Alaska, for drilling oil and natural gas. That is the requirement. And when you look at the numbers here, there's a study that shows that 1/4 of all the carbon emissions generated in the United States have been generated in federal lands and waters like the Gulf of Mexico and Alaska. So this law, which is now being hailed as a breakthrough in curbing carbon emissions, is actually saying that if you want solar, there has to be the continuation of oil and natural gas drilling and use. That's the mandate there. So this is really, an astounding, astonishing, and really unconscionable, feature of this act. And I'll just quickly give the second example, that this law provides financial incentives for the use of what is called carbon capture and storage, CCS. Now that sounds really cool, that here we have, carbon that's being emitted into the atmosphere, and there's a technology, carbon capture, and storage. What does that mean? It means that, you capture the carbon that's being belched out of the smokestacks of factories, or the carbon that's in the ground from the drilling of oil and natural gas, and then you store it. All right, so that is being hailed as a great move to limit carbon emissions. But here we look more deeply into the reality of this. The first question is, why is the fossil fuel industry, Exxon Mobil, Chevron, why are they so enthusiastic about carbon capture and storage? Well, one, they heavily invested in it. But why are they heavily invested in it? And here is an amazing fact, Andy, that most of the carbon capture and storage is recycled into the further drilling of fossil fuels. What do I mean? They recover this carbon, and then they inject that carbon into the ground in order to extract more oil and natural gas. So you have the marquee of carbon capture and storage, but this is actually contributing to the further exploration, drilling, and use of fossil fuels. And I want the audience to take careful note. The U.S. economy is a globalized imperialist economy. And you have companies like General Motors, Exxon, Mobil, you have Ford. They invest overseas. And when they build a factory overseas, those factories emit carbon. And they like to set up facilities in third world countries, in countries of the global south, where the restrictions on the emissions of carbon and safety standards and wage standards, where they're super exploiting people, in short, are lax. So they emit more carbon in their overseas operations, especially in the third world. That carbon is not counted as the output of the U.S. economy when they calculate how much the U.S. is responsible for global emissions.
That's very powerful, Raymond. Just in closing this first part of the interview, I think we should just, if you could just add in, what is the cost in what to the people who live in those countries, in the mass of refugees this is going to create?
What's confronting humanity is a situation where hundreds of millions of people, by some projections it may be 1 billion, will be forced to flee their homelands, their villages, because of floods, more serious and severe storms, the devastation of agriculture. There are now over 100 million refugees on the planet, people that have been forced to flee because of persecution, civil wars, and this climate crisis. This is the state of the world. 1 of 78 people on this planet is a refugee right now, either within a country forced to flee from one region to another or fleeing across borders. The crisis of the environment, what we're describing, global warming, it is a planetary phenomenon. It knows no boundaries. It knows no borders. But the most devastating effects of it are being felt in the global south, and the U.S. is the greatest cause of, historically, of this situation. And it's on us to confront this and to make the revolution that is the only way out for humanity.